So I'm going to take you through an example. And for part of my doctoral degree, so my background is as a teacher of the deaf, and there were a number of deaf people, themselves deaf, who are professionals providing support either to families or children, and they wanted PBS training. So for part of my doctoral research, I did one study where I provided training to 11 deaf staff in American Sign Language, and I did a 40-hour course in functional assessment and positive behavior support in sign language for these deaf staff. And then the second part of my study, I got one of the people who took the course, acted as a consultant and provided service to the family. And so I coached her in actually providing PBS service to a family. So the consultant, the person who was working as the consultant, was herself deaf. She was a staff person who worked at an agency supporting families who have deaf children. The parents, we had a mom and a dad. Mom was a homemaker and provided primary support to the child. Dad worked outside of the home and he worked shift work, so he wasn't always there when we were implementing interventions, but when he was there, we involved him in providing support, and eventually Mom taught him to provide support when he was home. She was like, okay, it's your turn now. Here, you take over. The child, Kieran, was an 8-year-old child, profoundly deaf, diagnosed with cerebral palsy and autism, so he had multiple disabilities, and he had a variety of problem behaviors, including non-compliance, physical interference, and resistance. So anytime anybody tried to sort of direct him to do something, he would hit and push away and things like that. Negative vocalization, so lots of sort of screaming and yelling, and severe food refusal behavior. And so he's a kid who ate very few foods. He'd never really eaten at the table as a meal with his family. He was kind of, they'd bring food to him and he'd graze. So my consultant went in and did a functional assessment interview, and she got a bunch of information about Kieran's problem behaviors. So she identified that negative vocalizations included whining and yelling. He also engaged in some signing, negative signing, not, no, no, no. Non-compliance was just simply ignoring his parents, right? I'm going to pretend that I don't see you asking me to do things. Leaving assigned area, so at his house, they lived in a house with stairs, and he can crawl, so he kind of commando crawled in their house because their house was kind of too small for his wheelchair. He used a manual wheelchair at school, but he crawled around his house at home, and if he didn't like what was going on, he'd crawl away. And then physical interference, so he'd push parents' hands away, he'd turn away from parents, he'd do those kinds of things, sort of physically interfere with what they were trying to get him to do. Antecedents for problem behavior. Parent request to engage in any specific request that he didn't want to engage in. So things like homework, eating, going for a bath, you name it, pretty much anything that wasn't on his agenda. If the parent tried to provide physical assistance to complete tasks, so they asked him to do something and he didn't comply, and so they came in and I'm going to physically prompt you to do this. That never went over well. And then finally, parent request to stop engaging in preferred activities, particularly anything computer or TV related, right? Stop computer and do something else was never met with a happy response. And maintaining consequences across the board for this kid, escape. He would escape doing tasks that his parents wanted him to do. He would escape eating non-preferred foods. He would escape the transitions, or at the very least delay them. For him, broad setting events, lack of predictability, particularly around expectations and transitions, so the big picture of what's going to happen. And he had pretty decent sign language skills. He was literate. He's got good reading skills. Mom and dad sign relatively well, right? Again, hearing parents always have to learn how to use signs, so they're learning a second language, and these parents are also dealing with the fact that he's got cerebral palsy, and right, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on besides deafness, so right, learning sign language is but one of the things that they're trying to focus on, but they had pretty good communication skills with him, but still, right, he often didn't have a good sense of what the expectations are, when do I get what I want, how are things going to roll out here. He didn't have a lot of choice in his day in terms of daily activities. Much of his day was kind of dictated. It's time to do this, it's time to do this, it's time to do this. If he was tired, that was a setting event for him. And he didn't sleep really well. He was a kid who tended to take a while to fall asleep. He tended to wake up a lot during the night. He also had extremely long days. He attended the school for the deaf. and he lives a ways away. So he was the first, I believe, on the bus in the morning, and his bus came, I think, at about 7:30-ish in the morning, and he was the last to be dropped off at the end of the day. So I think on some days it was like 4:30, 5 o'clock sometimes if traffic was really bad before he was getting off. Sometimes it was 4, right? But he could have really long days, and so now we've got a kid who hasn't slept well and who's had this very, very long day. Physical fatigue for him was also an issue, so he has a motor impairment. At school he has a manual chair and he is able to push his manual chair, but that takes some work. And at home, he moves by crawling around the house. That takes some physical effort. So he's expending more physical energy than other kids may be expending. And then finally, poor nutrition. Because of his food refusal behavior, he really wasn't getting very good nutrition at all, and you could see it. He was underweight, dark circles under his eyes, quite pasty. You could see in his physicality that he wasn't getting sufficient nutrition. And not because the parents weren't trying, but you can't force feed a kid, right? What do you do as a parent? Well, you kind of provide what he eats and hope that he's going to get enough, right? You try to get him to eat what you can, and understandably, that's you can't force food down his throat. At the end of indirect assessment, the consultant generated some hypotheses about his behavior. So I'm going to show you the hypotheses statements for 3 different routines that we targeted for this kid. One was transition to bath, and so this was, he's playing after dinner, mom says it's time to have a bath, and he's supposed to head on towards the bathtub. That never happened. For this routine, setting events were pretty common across all routines, but lack of predictability about what was going to happen, lack of choice, if he was tired, if he was physically fatigued, poor nutrition, those things all made it more likely that he'd engage in problem behavior when asked to transition to bath. The antecedent was simply the parent request, right? Time to stop this, go have a bath. He would engage in a variety of problem behavior, negative vocalizations, signing, non-compliance, leaving the area, actually going in the opposite direction of the bathroom, physical interference if mom tried to physically guide him, and he would escape the independent transition. Essentially what would happen at the end of the day, somebody would have to carry him physically to the bath. He wasn't going on his own. Now this was fine if dad was home, but he was 8 and he was getting to be a bit big for mom to carry, and she was to the point where she was starting to get back injuries. And so this is why this routine in particular was important for mom, was because, yes, I want him to do this independently, but 2, I can't carry him anymore. I'm hurting myself trying to carry him to the bath, so we have to do something about this. The second transition, or the second routine that we targeted, was a transition off of the computer to anything else. Again, lack of predictability about expectations, not a lot of choice, tired, seemed to be most related to increased likelihood of problem behavior. Parent says it's time to stop the computer, shut down the computer. He'd engage in problem behavior, mostly negative vocalizations or negative signs, non-compliance, physical interference if mom tried to get in there and make him shut the computer down, and he would delay shutting down the computer. Eventually, mom would just take the computer away. He never did shut it down. She'd just finally take it away from him, and then he'd scream for quite some time. And then finally, dinner, because the fact that he wasn't eating was of primary concern to everybody. So again, for him, lack of predictability about expectations, lack of choice. He also had a real lack of experience eating independently. He has a motor impairment, you're gonna see in the video. It takes a lot of work for him to use utensils, to stab food, to get it to his mouth, to get the utensil back down because he has a motor impairment. So it takes a lot of work, and he hasn't really had a lot of experience doing that. So there's a skill deficit there for him. He also has a long history of food refusal, and mom reported that really as early as about 8 to 10 months, he had started refusing, like he wouldn't have a bottle, he wouldn't have milk. By about 8 or 9 months, he'd stopped drinking milk. And as they started to shift him to food, he refused most foods. So this was something that had been going on for years because he's 8 now. So we now have this long history of behavior, okay? So at the end of the day, those were the hypotheses. And as we go throughout today, you're gonna see what the behavior looked like beforehand, and then you're gonna see what it looked like after we solved it. So you kind of get to see the process for him. Okay, so that's the end of indirect assessment. At the end of indirect assessment, we should have those hypotheses statements. What are the setting events? What are the antecedents? What's the problem behavior? What are the maintaining consequences that seem to be, right, all connected in this particular problem?